Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 165, James Thomas Walker. Part 1. James Thomas Walker was the cousin of Thomas Walker from episode 164, Walker's Will. Acknowledgement to Dorothy Gibson Wild, who wrote a detailed thesis on James Thomas Walker in 1992, which was referenced for parts of this episode. If you're wanting to know a great deal more about James Thomas Walker, I have placed the link to her thesis on my Facebook post. James Thomas Walker was a prominent banker and financier and was from a prominent family in Australian commercial history for nearly a century. He was a Federation father who served as an Independent Freetrader in the first federal parliament. James Thomas was known as Jamie to his family, and he was born in Leith, Scotland on the 20th of March 1841. Thomas Walker, who was James Thomas Walker's great-grandfather, entered the wine trade at Leith in about 1740. He prospered and acquired his own wharf. His success may have been fostered by his marriage to Anne Hume, who was the daughter of another merchant with interests in the West Indies. Thomas Walker's sons continued in the wine trade, and the eldest son, John, who was James Thomas's father, succeeded to the management of the Leith headquarters. The business continued to prosper until the beginning of the 19th century, and he improved his social position and acquired a country seat with the lease of Castlestead's farm near Dalkeith from the Duke of Buccleuch. Business increased to such a degree that his younger brother Thomas was sent to open a branch in Bordeaux, France. However, Leith declined as a trade in their port due to the outbreak of the war with France after the French Revolution and the development of the Clyde ports that took over the West Indian trade. So the merchants of Leith had to diversify, and they turned their interest to the colony of New South Wales. New South Wales had only been founded 12 years previously, and it offered a welcome new outlet. He was the eldest surviving son of John William Walker, the youngest brother of James Walker by his second wife, Catherine Lyon, whom he married in 1778. Catherine Lyon was the grandniece of John Glass, founder of the Glassite Church, whose teachings were to have a considerable influence on James. Though of the same generation as his cousin Thomas, James Thomas Walker was 37 years younger. So James's father John took over the management of the family business at Leith on the death of his father in 1837. By 1844, he had 6 children. The eldest was 19 and the youngest only a few months old. And John decided to move his family to Australia, and on the 23rd of October 1844, the family departed on the General Hewitt from Gravesend. With them was the widowed Anne Miller, who was James's aunt. James recalled a little of the journey in later years, but mainly grew up listening to the reminiscences of his parents and his eldest sister Kate, and of the nursemaid, Margaret Espy, who accompanied them to Australia. During the first few weeks of the voyage, the vessel encountered extremely rough weather, and John Thomas was rescued by the first mate just when a wave was about to suck him through a porthole. His head was cut on this occasion, and he carried the scar for the rest of his life. By the time John Thomas Walker and his family emigrated, there was a widespread network that spanned 2 generations of the Walker clan. And they were already well respected and well connected in Sydney, and its members had already started to amass considerable fortunes. They'd established an almost legendary reputation as astute, successful and trustworthy businessmen who invested wisely and managed their affairs with expertise. After 3 months in Sydney, John took up a freehold property of nearly 1,300 acres near Burrawa and named it Carlstead's after the former family property in Scotland. They initially lived in simply a bark hut. It had 4 rooms, suggesting it was a little more palatial than most bark huts of the day. They then built a large shearing shed and other buildings, and yards were erected, and a regular pattern of station life was established. 3 outstations were operating by December 1845, and a Sydney builder had been contracted to erect better accommodation for the family, and by late 1846 they'd moved into a substantial stone house that still forms part of the Castlestead's homestead. The property was mainly devoted to sheep, but some crops were planted, and John appears to have occupied the role of a gentleman overseer. By 1847, John was considering making arrangements to return to Edinburgh. It's not clear whether he intended leaving John William Manning to manage the property or employing a manager, but John William Manning was killed in a riding accident on the 22nd of March 1848. And then within 4 months, John's youngest daughter Annie died after a fall, and John and his wife could stand no more. They sold Castle Steads to Hamilton Hume, who I did an episode on in episode 109, and they sold it on the 13th of September 1848, £1,300, apparently at a loss. The family returned to Sydney by mail coach, and on the 24th of September 1848 they embarked on the Tasmania, bound for London via Rio de Janeiro. They had a very rough crossing across the Pacific. The vessel barely limped into the harbour at Rio de Janeiro, where it was immediately condemned. So the family was stranded there, and another child, Elizabeth, was born but died soon afterwards. Another vessel, the Ben McDouey, was sent to rescue them, but the return voyage to London was not completed until March 1849, a total of 7 months after leaving Sydney. Unlike the enterprises of his kinsman, John Walker's Australian adventure had ended not in success and increased wealth, but tragedy and comparative poverty. As they'd sold their property at Springfield Place prior to the emigration, John and his family lived for a time with his wife's brother George and his family at the Waterston family home. Then eventually they moved into flats at 23 London Road, where they lived frugally while John had to re-establish himself in business. His attempt to become an Australian pastoralist had apparently proved financially crippling, but with sturdy independence that he passed on to his sons, he refused to borrow money to live in greater style, believing in cutting his coat according to his cloth. By this time, James was 8 years old enough to have distant recollections of the voyage home and the change in financial circumstances, and witnessing the death of his brother and sister. He'd moved from the freedoms of station life to cramped confines of a heaving ship, and then back to a more formal life at an Edinburgh household. The family's financial circumstances only lasted a few months, and there was an improvement as in 1850, Anne Miller returned from Australia and she purchased or leased a house where John William Walker and his family moved in. James Thomas never forgot this period. Many years later he wrote, "Our own comparative poverty always made me sympathetic with others in an even worse position." And he also remarked later in life that the environment in early years often makes or mars a man's career, and he acknowledged the debt that he owed his parents for their care in his youth. The Walkers were a conventional, close-knit and pious Victorian family. James Thomas's recollections in later life fit the conventional stereotype, and keeping in mind that his parents were both Glassites and their teachings had a considerable influence on the young James Thomas, although he did later become a Presbyterian. What are the Glassites? Well, the Glassite Church was an offshoot of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. It was founded in 1730 by John Glass, and the followers of this particular branch were known as Glassites. They remained distinctly separate and were somewhat a bit of a clan, and they tended to intermarry. Temperance was above all part of their teachings, and they also placed a lot of weight on brotherly love. They were concerned more with the day-to-day living out of Christian principles rather than the church organisation. Particular stress was placed on the care of the needy amongst the congregation, and distributions of funds were made anonymously to avoid embarrassment to the recipients, and surplus funds were donated to the needy of other faiths. Once back in England, James Thomas started school at the Circus Place School, a preparatory school for boys, and in 1852, aged 11, James Thomas began studies at the Edinburgh Institution, and this was regarded as one of the best schools in Edinburgh. Reverend Alexander Reid was the headmaster from 1850 to 1858, and he held his headmaster in high regard. Reid impressed on his senior students that they should be thinking of the future, and it was Reid that encouraged his students to begin keeping diaries, recording their daily activities and thoughts. So on his 15th birthday, James Thomas commenced to record his life that he continued with only a few breaks until he was 80 years old. His headmaster, Dr. Reed, noted on James William as a student, as he possesses good natural abilities and considerable powers of application, I think he is likely to do well in any profession or occupation to which his time and attention may be devoted. James Thomas completed his formal education in May 1861. There was no pressure for him to decide immediately on a career, and in the same month that he left school, his father leased Ravensnook Farm at Pennacuick, which then became the family home, though they continued to share the Edinburgh house with Anne Miller. The property had 250 acres of arable land and 300 acres of moorland that was used as a sheep walk. Several labourers were employed on the farm, including a grieve, a shepherd and at least 2 ploughmen. John Walker's boys helped with the work, and although James Thomas does not seem to have taken farm work very seriously, he did absorb the techniques of farming, management of employees, living in the country life generally, and gaining an experience in riding and handling guns, all of which proved useful later in Australia. James Thomas studied geometry at the Edinburgh Institution and German and French with private tutors, and he also started drawing classes in April 1857 when he enrolled at the Edinburgh School of Design. Experience of simple accounting was acquired by helping his father balance the farm books. He was seldom idle. Over a year elapsed before he started work. At the age of 16 in September 1857, his father arranged for him to go to the office of Alex Cohen and Sons, paper manufacturers at Valleyfield near their home. As a learner, he received no remuneration. The work involved routine office work, copying correspondence and running messages, and occasionally assisting with carrying to the factory the heavy box of coins required to pay the workers. He discovered that he enjoyed the orderly routine of office work. After 6 months, his father decided that James needed wider experience of office procedures and directed him to give notice to Cohen's, and his father arranged for him to go to the office of Allen's Phoenix Insurance, and he was paid £10 a year. The work involved gathering insurance premiums and keeping accounts. It was at this time that James Thomas moved to the house in Edinburgh with his sister Kate, and in his spare time he continued to study French and German as well as private study of Latin. James visited London in September 1859 for 6 weeks, and not only allowed him to familiarise himself with the city, but he became better acquainted with relatives there. His cousin, Archibald Walker, was 36 years older than James Thomas, and he'd returned from Australia in the late 1850s, and he took him into his office for a time, giving him a number of tasks and testing his arithmetic and bookkeeping skills. And note that he wrote to Archibald Walker, I am still desirous of entering into a merchant's counting house in London, as the office in which I am engaged does not afford me the opportunity of acquiring general knowledge of mercantile affairs, which is necessary, and which is my wish to possess. I shall therefore feel obliged if you will kindly interest yourself on my behalf, and mention my name should you hear of any suitable opening. It shall not be for any want of exertion on my part if I do not succeed. This request was successful. However, he got a bout of scarlet fever that delayed his departure by several weeks, but on the 13th of February 1860 he left Edinburgh by train, just over a month before his 90th birthday. With him went not only the well-wishers of his family, but of his fellow workers, with whom he had established excellent relations, and his employer, Mr. Allen, wrote, He has invariably acted uprightly, diligently, and satisfactorily. He leaves me with regret on my part, beyond the hope that his doing so is to lead a higher position in which it will ever be gratifying to me to learn that he is successful. James Thomas stayed for 2 years in London. He attended Glassite Church services regularly, and in general he behaved in a fashion that pleased his elders. He was becoming more self-sufficient. He lived with his uncle William Waterston, who acted as a loco parentis. A letter of introduction to his father's relative, George Glass Sandeman, secured him 2 weeks' experience in the office of Sandeman and Sons to acquire further knowledge of the procedures in a larger office. On the 2nd of March 1860, his cousin Archibald Walker informed him that a position was available in the London office of the Bank of New South Wales. There were numerous family connections with the bank, and James commenced work on the 12th of March 1860, beginning an association with the Bank of New South Wales that was to last with only a brief hiatus until the end of his life. The salary was £60 per annum to the 31st of December 1860, and to rise to £80 per annum in 1861, considerably more than he would have earned if he remained in Edinburgh. Initially, his work involved only copying colonial letters, which he enjoyed but thought he could easily manage something more difficult. The bank required the sum of £2,000 as a guarantee for good behaviour. His father did not hesitate to do so, writing, "I have such confidence in your good conduct that I will at once give the guarantee to the bank." On his 19th birthday, he wrote, "I hope that if spared I may be a more useful member of society. I should be very ungrateful indeed if I did not feel happy and contented with my present situation." So he started studying bookkeeping under the supervision of his Uncle William, and he showed himself to be reliable when he was given a variety of work. And once settled, he enrolled with the sanction of his father in the English Language and Literature Department at King's College, and later in 1861 commenced German. He also joined the Scottish Rifle Volunteer Corps in the North Division. So with the advice of Archibald Walker, in 1861 he did make his mind up to venture to Australia, and Archibald Walker wrote to his brother Thomas Walker on his behalf regarding the possibility of obtaining work, and a reply came from Thomas Walker in November 1861, informing him that with a recommendation from Mr. Lanark, he would get a position in the Bank of New South Wales. So after ensuring his father was agreeable, he decided to migrate. On the 12th of December 1861, he finished work at the London branch of the Bank of New South Wales, and Donald Lanark, who'd been a benevolent employer, regretted his departure but provided him with an excellent reference. "I regret very much to part with him, for I have always found him most efficient in every duty entrusted to him. I trust, however, he may find employment in this bank with you, and with my cordial recommendations of him." On the 7th of January 1862, he boarded the Swiftsure bound for Melbourne 2 months before his 21st birthday. On the voyage out, James Thomas, perhaps trying to appear a little more mature than his years, found himself the butt of a practical joke that was engineered by a number of colonials. He was challenged by another passenger to a duel. The captain eventually enlightened him that he'd been a victim of a well-organised hoax, but he did not enjoy this experience. Though he took it in good part and joined in the general laughter, it taught him a lesson on colonial attitudes to young British migrants. In future, he was careful not to leave himself so open to pranksters. On the 19th of April 1862, 17 years after his first arrival, James Thomas Walker returned to Australia, landing at Sandridge Pier, Melbourne. He was the guest of David Moore, former partner in William Walker and Company. His friend Ted Walker was visiting Melbourne, and the Browns also made him welcome at Heartlands, where William Benjamin Walker and family and the Darley family were staying. This reference to the Broughton family and Heartlands as well as Browns was covered in episode 42 and in episode 58. James then travelled to Sydney on the Wonga Wonga in the company of William Benjamin Walker and his sons. He arrived in Sydney on the 27th of April 1862, presented his credentials the following day at the Bank of New South Wales, and was engaged the day after to start as a clerk on the 1st of May 1862 with a salary of £150 a year, £50 more than he might have expected if he remained in England. The reference from Donald Lanark virtually guaranteed him a job. The bank required another £2,000 fidelity bond, which his father again paid willingly. His father warned him too to be careful with whom he trusted and to be prudent. Though on the fringe of the family, James Thomas was accepted by the wider Walker family, and his career was certainly fostered by family connections. James Thomas only spent a month in Sydney. He wanted to be closer to his brother at Rockhampton in Queensland. So on the 29th of May 1862, he was offered the position of accountant in the Rockhampton branch of the Bank of New South Wales, and he was only too happy to accept the promotion. He sailed the following day on the Eagle, and he was well equipped to embark on a banking career in Queensland. By this stage, he'd had a diverse experience of clerical work. He was acquainted with country life, and the Australian environment seemed to be a place of adventure, excitement and opportunity. And the Walker family by this stage was one of the oldest and best known families in the colony and were described as a family of Australian merchant princes. He arrived at Rockhampton on the 5th of June 1862. He was buoyant and optimistic, but unfortunately Rockhampton did not live up to what he expected. It only had a population of 1,400 people, and he said that it did not look as important a place as I expected. And he said it was quite amusing, the contrast between here and London, everything on such a different scale, but never say die. And in all fairness, he continued, to do the place justice, however, it is a most pushing and thriving town. The Bank of New South Wales was a small timber building, and it was on the fringes of the commercial centre of town. Walker was originally the accountant, but in October 1862 he took over the duties of teller, dealing directly with the public. Business fluctuated with the fortunes of Rockhampton. Walker had arrived as the town was expanding. In the following 4 years he witnessed its decline from boom to comparative stagnation, only to boom again before sliding into a decline that was exacerbated by the drought of 1866 and the financial crisis in Britain. There was ample business to sustain 3 banks by October 1862. James Thomas's mother died on the 10th of May 1863, and Walker found it quite difficult to comprehend. He said, "How hard it is to believe that we shall never meet again on earth." It was not their father, but their sister Kate and Dr. Brown who wrote to tell of her death and to offer comfort. Within 12 months came the news that his father had married on the 21st of March 1864 to Catherine Bell, the eldest sister of his brother-in-law Imrie Bell. Walker liked Catherine, whom he'd known in Edinburgh, but was unhappy at the haste in which his father entered into matrimony again. Kate, who'd cared for her mother until her death, left the household and went to Germany, and Walker mourned, "Our family is indeed, in one sense of the word, broken up." In November 1863, his youngest brother, William Henry, known as Willie, arrived to work at Gracemere, so at least the 3 brothers were together again. They were making plans to enter business together. They acquired station properties, with Tom and Willie handling the practical side and James the financial matters. But in October 1864, Tom suddenly fell ill. Initially, he was thought to be suffering from sunstroke, but when he continued to suffer further attacks in the following weeks, it was apparent he was more seriously ill with epilepsy. Unfortunately, Tom suffered another attack while swimming alone at Urella and drowned on the 23rd of January 1865. The loss affected Walker even more deeply than that of his mother's death, and dreams of future ventures together suddenly vanished. He was without his best friend and his confidant. W.I. Brown, recognising James's ability, offered him the post of 3rd officer in the customs office at Rockhampton, but Walker rejected the offer. Apart from other considerations, the pay was not as good as working in the bank. His salary increased from the initial £150 to £300 per annum by 1865. He purchased a share in a small boat and made some capital gains buying and selling land, so he was making reasonable financial progress. A telegram arrived on the 3rd of March 1866 advising that he'd been appointed manager to open a new branch at the Bank of Townsville, which was a new settlement 400 miles further north of Rockhampton. He'd earned both respect and affection in Rockhampton, and this was attested by the testimonial that was accompanied by a parting gift of a gold watch and chain. It was signed by the mayor and most of the leading citizens in Rockhampton, and it read, "We cannot allow you to leave Rockhampton without expressing to you, in some tangible shape, our appreciation of many good qualities whilst residing in Rockhampton. All have observed the zealous manner in which you have done your part in forwarding every movement for the social well-being and moral advancement of the community." He left Rockhampton on the 7th of March 1866 aboard the SS Williams. For the first time in his life, at the age of 24, he would be independent. No family members or kinsfolk resided in Townsville. The voyage from Rockhampton took 10 days. Townsville was founded only 16 months earlier, and it only had a few buildings of any size. The 2-storey Criterion Hotel, where Walker found accommodation, dominated the townscape, and on the other side of the rocky outcrop was a wharf, a warehouse and a hotel, and the only other building was a court and customs house. There was much to be done on his arrival. He had to find a rented premises, furnish the office, and establish all the procedures and functions of the branch. Robert Towns, after which the town was named, was making his only visit. Towns was a director of the Bank of New South Wales and was extremely annoyed that his advice to establish a branch sooner had not been followed, and the Australian Joint Stock Bank had already been opened in the town. He was an irascible old man, but Walker appeared to have got on with him quite well. The branch was opened only 4 days after Walker arrived on Tuesday the 20th of March, which was his 25th birthday. Business at Townsville was even slower than at Rockhampton. Having arranged the office, he found that he had no need to open longer than 3 hours a day. He remembered his 9 months in the township as probably his happiest time as a bank officer in Australia, that they were all good friends and that it was his first managership. In December 1866, he moved to a manager's position at Toowoomba. In transferring from Townsville to Toowoomba, he moved from one of the most recently settled regions in Queensland to one of the oldest. It was a well-established municipality by 1866 and had a hierarchy of influential squatters and storekeepers. But the boom had recently turned to bust with the effect of the drought and the financial crisis. The Bank of New South Wales was forced to foreclose on some of its creditors, but the value of property held as security had declined to such an extent that the Toowoomba branch was seen as a liability. The bank sent up persons to Toowoomba to investigate. James continued to rescue the Toowoomba branch. He worked night and day, buoyed by the philosophy that nothing like working with a will when there is something to be done. And by early 1868, Archer was able to write, "I believe Walker has done his part well." For the next 10 years, Walker carried on resuscitating the Toowoomba branch, but he grew discontented. In 1873, officers were prohibited from investing in mining ventures without the permission of the head office. Walker had formed a small, not particularly successful partnership in tin mining at Stanthorpe with Westby Palmer and others the year prior, and he was particularly incensed at the directive. It says, "My very blood boils at this interference with personal liberty. There was little he could do, other than express a mild disagreement, though, for fear of losing his job." He was trustworthy and effective, and this was attested by the fact that in 1870 he was sent to inspect the branches at Gympie and Warwick when problems arose. In 1871 he was the acting manager of Brisbane and the inspector for Queensland, and he shared this role with McCarthy of Brisbane. After McCarthy's sudden death, Walker continued alone with no obvious difficulty in coping with the workload. In his time in the Brisbane office, he expanded his banking experience and had introduced him to many of the business identities of Brisbane, but for 12 months he received only £70 remuneration for the additional work he did. In October 1875, he again filled in, inspecting the Warwick branch, and in January 1877, he drove his own buggy to Goondiwindi, a journey of 3.5 days, to help open a branch there. It appears that he fulfilled his duties admirably for the bank, but he was passed over for promotion. He was extremely disappointed, and the actual cause not stated, in November 1877 when again he was overlooked, and he reacted bitterly. He says there is scarcely anything more galling to certain temperaments than to see personal preferences supersede faithful services. At my time of life, I have been at all events moderately successful as a manager. This is not encouraging. I try to be philosophical and humble, but it's a hard struggle. However, we must avoid getting soured. The long-desired change came in July 1878 when Walker was appointed acting assistant manager at Brisbane. He was relieving Brown, who was on leave at the time, and then Brown decided to resign. Archer informed Smith of Brown's resignation on the 19th of September 1878 with the writer that Walker was, in his opinion, the most suitable man in my district for the position. His next letter, Archer expanded further and said, "A hand with the pluck and energy of a J.T. Walker will be to our advantage here at the present time." Walker was then assistant manager of the Brisbane branch and assistant inspector and second in charge of Queensland operations. J.T. Walker's interest in education extended to support for the founding of the national schools in the suburbs developed around Toowoomba, and he supported strongly the founding of the grammar school at Toowoomba, but caused a disturbance by proposing that higher education opportunities should be provided for girls as well as boys. This was the first example of his support for better education for women that culminated with his long service on the Council of Women's College of Sydney University, and it also animated his championship of women's rights in federal parliament later on. In August 1867, he wrote to Smith enclosing a letter of introduction from Sir Daniel Cooper that had been presented at the bank in Toowoomba by Mrs. Thomas Palmer, a widow living at Highfields Road, 7 miles from Toowoomba. Mrs. Palmer, of Irish gentry, was a charming woman but with no business sense, and she was a domineering matriarch. Accompanied by her husband Thomas, his brother William, and 10 of their 12 children, 7 daughters and 3 sons, she'd arrived in Brisbane on the 6th of January 1865. Initially, the family lived at Gregory Terrace, but Thomas died. One of the Palmer children was Jeanette. She was 19 and was said to be the beauty of the family, and Walker was bewitched. On the 28th of February 1868, while on a riding party, he proposed and Jeanette accepted. Just over 2 months later, on the 16th of April 1868, Walker and Jeanette were married in the parlour of her family home Rangeview. His brother Willie, down from Rockhampton, acted as best man. Jeanette was 19 and Walker 27. They lived in the quarters at the bank with 2 servants, 2 dogs, 2 horses, and during the week, Jeanette's brothers William and Frank, and it was a comfortable existence. On the 20th of December 1871, they had their first child, Archibald Lyon Walker, and just over a year later, on the 12th of January 1873, John Percival was born, a delicate child who lived for only 5 months, dying on the 20th of June 1873. The family continued to grow, and on the 4th of April 1874, Emily Percival, known as Sissy, arrived, and then on the 4th of February 1876, Alexander Fitzjames, known as Alec, was born. However, Jeanette's next pregnancy ended sadly. In January 1877, she suffered a severe bout of typhoid fever and prematurely delivered stillborn twin girls. She remained ill for some months and recovered only very slowly. Jeanette then lost another child by miscarriage in February 1878, and she'd borne 7 children in under 8 years by this time. In part 2, I'll be covering J.T. Walker's young family and how he fared in being able to financially support them. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.